All right, finding the percent of a number. All right, so first let's look at the essential question today, which is how can you use mental math to find the percent of a number? So pretty much using no paper, pencil, calculations, just doing all this in your head. So look at the comic here. It says, "I love secrets." Okay, and the dog ends up saying, "I have a secret way for finding 21% of 80." And then he goes to explain 10% is 8 and 1% is 0.8. And then so 21% is 8 plus 8 plus 0.8 is equal to 16.8. Obviously the cat looks really excited, says get out of here, but let's explain how that dog came. The dog is correct. Let's figure out how he did that. So scroll down here to example number 1. Okay, it kind of explains a little bit about what the dog did. So how did Newton know that 10% of 80 is 8? Okay, you'll see in the picture here, well, the first part says, right, 10% is a fraction. Well, we just did the other day, 10%, and percent being out of 100. So 10% would be 10 out of 100, as you see in this fraction right here. Okay, 10 out of 100 there. And for every 10 that we have, it'll be out of 100. And we can simplify 10 100ths to 1/10, because if you divide top and bottom, we get there. So it's kind of the same idea there. We can use that later on. So the first one we'll look at is the model. Let's use the model. So if we do 0 through 100%, 0 starting here, 100% down here, okay, and we break it up into 10% units, because I said what 10% is. Well, we notice that here 0 is at 0, down here is 80, okay, 80 being the full 100%, because they're talking about 80 is being the 100% there. But we know that 50% would be 40, that's halfway between 0 and 100%. And half will kind of give us a guideline of where we need to be at. Well, think about these 10% increments from here to here. Well, if you go from 0 to 40, and we know that's only 50%, we have another 40 at the back end. So what I wanted to get across here is, if you would take that 40 and divide it up into 5 groups, we would find out that each group is worth 8. Hence, this is each representing this 10%. So every 10% is another 8. And if you add up 10 of these groups, you would add up to 80, because 8 times 10 is 80. So that's how our first 10% comes there. Okay? And you just go through and say, okay, 10% is 8, 10% is 8, and then we have to go to the next part, which is the 1%, which is show you the next thing. So far I have 8, 8, 16 there. Now if you look in right below this, we have method 2, which is using multiplication, our key words. 10% of 80. 10%, we can't use percent, so you have to change it to either a decimal or a fraction. In this case, they changed 10% to a fraction, 1/10. Next step is the word of. Of always implies multiplication right there. So you have 1/10 times, and then times 80. Now you have your fraction, multiply out. Top times top, 1 times 80 is 80 right here. 10 times imaginary 1 there is 10. 80 divided by 10, until the answer is 8. So again, that's the 10%. So 10%, 8 and 8 is 16 so far. Now, they also had a little example here on the bottom. How do you move the decimal point to find 10% of a number? Well, if you'll notice, 10% here, let's put the example over here. If you move the decimal places 1 time to the left, it ends up being 10%. Now, you remember yesterday from our notes, we kind of talked about how moving it twice involves either multiplying or dividing. When we move to the right, for instance, if it was 80 and we have the decimal here, if we said multiply by 100, we move to the right. Well, in this case, when we're dealing with it, we're going to end up going backwards. Okay, now we're not doing 100, we're not dividing by 100 in this case. Today we're doing 10%. So 10% is a fraction. So a fraction of something is going to make it smaller. So we're starting at 80. Since we're going only down by 10%, we're only going back 1 time. If we're going back to 1%, it'd be 1 more. Okay. All right. Looking at activity 2. Activity 2 involves finding 1%. So we have the two 10%. Now we got to find the 1%, because they wanted to know. Remember the problem was, what is 21% of 80? We already found out that 10% and 10% is each 8, we got to find out what that 1% is. Okay? And how did Newton do it? Well, he did the whole decimal check moving over 1 time and knows that if 10% is 8, then that means that 10% of 10% is actually 1%, and that 1% is going to be 0.8, because if you do 0.8 times 10, that gives you 8, which represents 10% there. So this 0.8 represents just 1%. So we can put over here 1% is no longer unknown. We know it as 0.8. And that's how the dog figured out, because 8 plus 0.8 is 16.8. Now flipping over to the other examples, we can use this to apply to do other mental math. Okay, using mental math to find each percent of a number. So we have 12% of 40. Okay, you'll notice in the example here, 10% of 40. Well, 10% represents 4. Okay, 10% represents 4, and then we have two 1%. So see, we have 10% plus 1% is 1. 10% is 4, and well, if 10% is 4, that means that 0.4 must be for 1%. Add those up, we end up able to get to our answer. Over here, letter B, 19% of 50. They're using 19% is equaling 10 plus 10, which is 20, but then subtracting that 1% at the end. Okay, well, 10% of 50, okay, is equal to 5. Okay, so we have 5 plus 5, and then we know that 1% is equal to 0.5. So we have 5 plus 5, and then we have to subtract 0.5, get our answer of 9.5. All right, and why are we doing this? Well, and you'll see a lot in life. You're going to have to do a lot of mental math. One of them is tips, sales tax, a lot of different things you should be able to do in your head pretty quickly. So we'll do this one on here, but then you guys will be able to do it in class a little later on. They want to say, work with a partner to use mental math to find each percent of a number. Well, how do you calculate a 20% tip for a $30 meal? Well, for me, 20% is 10% plus 10%. Well, in this case, 10% is what? 3. And the other 10% is another 3. So in this case, our 20% would be $6. 18% would, for me, would be 10% plus 10% minus 1% minus 1%. So 10% in this case would be 3, do 3, 3, and then 1% would be 0.3, another 0.3. These are subtract, let's add up. So 3 plus 3 is 6. 6 minus 0.3 is 5.7, minus 0.3 again, which is 5.4. So we know it'd be $5.40 for that meal. All right, for the rest of these, C through H, I want you to go ahead and try to give those a try, and then bring those back in.